The first is a change to the Fair Work Act, where the Fair Work Commission has now been granted the opportunity to investigate claims of bullying and harassment in the workplace. An employee or worker who feel that they're being bullied has a right now to take their claim to the Fair Work Commission. The second act that's changing this year is the Privacy Act, and as of March this year there'll be a set of new privacy principles which replace the existing ones, but I'll come back to that in a minute. And thirdly, it's an aspect of the superannuation guarantee legislation that's changed, that requires a change to the products that are made available to employers and workers. So let me give you a bit more detail. The Fair Work Act now requires the Fair Work Commissioner to act on any request for mitigation of bullying that might be brought to the Fair Work Commission by an employee or worker. And I'm using worker because, like the work health and safety legislation, it's been broadened beyond an employer-employee relationship and now just talks about a worker. And a worker can be anybody. They can be a contractor, they can be a volunteer. So, for example, an on-hire worker who's working in a host company location, that is, and not their employer's location, who is being bullied, has a right to take a claim to the Fair Work Commission against the management of the on-hire location. The Commission's required to respond to this within 14 days, to investigate through conference and conciliation, and ultimately to issue an order impelling the bullier, the person, the company and the management to cease bullying and to make sure it doesn't happen again. The change in the Privacy Act is what they call harmonising what's previously been two different sets of privacy principles. The first, the information privacy principles, applied to government agencies, and the second, the national privacy principles, applied to businesses and non-government organisations. They've now been harmonised, and there are now 13 Australian privacy principles, or APPs. Not a lot's changed, but the significance for recruitment agencies, for example, are principles 7 and 9 particularly, I think, which deal with the collection and dissemination of personal information and data, and the use of and communication of that information internationally or offshore to anyone outside Australia and Australia's legislative environment. And finally, the superannuation guarantee legislation change has introduced a requirement for all default super funds that a company might run to include what they're calling the My Super product. Typically a recruitment agency might bring on a worker or a contractor or an on-hire employee who doesn't nominate or designate a particular super fund. The recruiter is required to pay the superannuation into what they call their default fund, and almost every company has a default fund. It's now a requirement that that default fund has a My Super product, and that product is a lower cost, no fringe benefits, frills and whistles, and one that's obliged, the trustees are obliged, to focus on the maximisation of the return on the investment into the super fund. All of the legislation, not just the ones that I've mentioned, that determine and govern the management of people in a business and workplace relationship apply to all sorts of people, and many of them have done away with the word employee and use the word worker, because it's no longer just the employer-employee relationship that matters. Let me give you an example. Recruitment agencies put on-hire staff into a client or host company operation. The on-hire person is not an employee of the host company, but they have the same rights as any employee under the Work Health and Safety, Fair Work, Superannuation Guarantee, Privacy and other pieces of legislation. The challenge for recruitment agencies is that they do not have the physical presence and therefore the hands-on management of the workplace, and that arm's length relationship adds some complexities to the situation. Although the investigation of bullying complaints comes under the Fair Work Commission, it's actually a health and safety issue. It's been well established that bullying and harassment in the workplace causes stress, and stress causes illness, and employees, workers will take leave from work. They'll use their personal leave because they are suffering ill health. Stress-related illnesses and absences from work are the worst possible things that an employer can manage, simply because there are aspects to it as to how do you organise workplace-based rehabilitation for this worker? How do you ensure that the stressors, the things that are causing the stress in the worker, are managed and removed in the workplace? It might not just be a bullying co-worker. And who's the person that actually decides that the worker is rehabilitated and fit for work again? Is it their GP? Is it the workplace-based rehab coordinator? Is it the employer? Is it the employee themselves? Managing stress-related personal leave is a real challenge. The major challenge for recruiters is that they often place their on-hire workers in a remote location, not their business premises, over which they don't have the management of the culture and the behaviour of other people working in that situation. However, they still have the obligation as the employer of the on-hire worker for ensuring that that workplace and that the worker themselves are free from stress, from bullying, from harassment, from other work health and safety issues. So the sorts of things that we recommend for recruitment agencies to do are the following sorts of things. Firstly, check with the host company, your client, as to their work health and safety policies and practices, and I mean, if possible, obtain copies of their policies. Where it's feasible, we also recommend that the recruiter does a site inspection and ensures that the workplace is free from hazards and risk and so on. So just to walk around, have a physical check. The third thing is maintaining relationship with whoever is managing your on-hire worker, and establish a communications protocol so that in the event of an accident or an incident, that manager or the manager of the workplace contacts you immediately, so that you, the recruiter, is kept informed as to what's happening to your employee. And finally, keep in touch with your employee on a regular basis. Catch up with them for a coffee every now and again. Make sure that they're happy, that they feel free from risk, free from harassment or bullying. If a recruiter has an on-hire worker in a remote location and they make a complaint of being bullied, the primary responsibility is with the recruiter as the employer of that on-hire worker. The obligations on the recruiter are therefore to deal with the management of the host location, to make sure that an appropriate investigation is undertaken, to perhaps participate in that investigation themselves. Ultimately, if the recruiter's unable to be confident that their worker is going to be free from stress, from risk, from work health and safety potential negative outcomes, then ultimately our recommendation is that you withdraw the worker from that site. The initiative of the federal government was what they called harmonisation. We've previously had two sets of privacy principles, one which applied to government agencies and one which applied to businesses. They've been overridden now by the new Australian privacy principles, of which there are 13, and they've replaced previous privacy principles that applied to businesses. The most significant changes concern how a recruitment agency deals with the information that they take on an applicant, for example. The major limitations or changes that the new privacy principles have brought into play limit what the agency can do with that information, provide additional requirements for security and appropriate access to that information. And there's a funny one, but if you're involved in sending anyone offshore, then there's a restriction on what countries you can send the personal information and data to, ensuring that they have privacy principles in that country that conform to or are similar to ours. I guess one of the easiest examples of privacy principles for a recruitment agency concern the personal data that they collect on an applicant. If an applicant's successful and they're placed with a client company, that's well and good. If an applicant's unsuccessful, and many are, then the agency, the recruiter, has two options. Firstly, they're required to destroy, dispose of, delete whatever personal information that they have obtained on that unsuccessful applicant. Or, with the applicant's permission, and only with their permission, they can keep that information on an applicant tracking database if they so require it and if they're given permission by the applicant, the unsuccessful applicant themselves. There's absolutely no substitute for having appropriate policies and practices. In the area of human resources management, a suite of human resources policies that cover things like attendance, leave, responsibility to the employer, use of electronic media where it's provided by the employer or the employee or worker's own media during working hours, are the sorts of things that HR policies should cover. Work health and safety policies are also absolutely essential, and they need to be formulated, they need to be communicated, and it needs to be ensured that the worker understands what those policies are. And they need to be regularly reminded, the workers need to be regularly reminded of the policies. It's no good just issuing a set of policies or a policy document once and then expecting that everyone understood them and that people remain conscious of those policies. And policies, particularly in the work health and safety area, around bullying and harassment, and policies in the HR area around the fiduciary duty, the obligation of the worker to the employer, need to be reinforced, and people need to be reminded of them on a reasonably regular basis. When a recruiter retains SDP for its managed services provision, we already do a number of the things that are required for compliance with the legislation. The most classic example is when a new contractor or on-hire employee starts and we're providing the managed services. We do an induction on work health and safety for that contractor or on-hire employee, so that requirement, that obligation on the part of the recruitment agency is taken care of by us. Similarly, where a sufficient number of contractors or on-hire employees are being placed in one location, in a specific location, we'll actually go out and do the site inspection, so that we'll do a walk around to ensure that the workplace is free of hazards and risks of things like trip or electrocution or the other typical sorts of hazards that you can find in the workplace. So we already do some of that when SDP is engaged as the managed services provider by a recruitment agency. What we're doing now, additionally, is offering a retained human resources management service so that we can become, if you like, the outsourced HR department for our client companies, where we'll work with that client to ensure that they have appropriate and relevant policies in human resources, in privacy, in work health and safety, and if required, we'll undertake specific projects for the client, such as establishing some form of performance management program, conducting salary surveys if that's what's required into a new industry or a new area of the recruitment agency's activity. So we, as I say, now offer literally the service of being your outsourced human resources department.